The gavel had not yet fallen, but every camera in the courtroom was already recording the end of an empire. Chairman Kang Ji-Hoon sat in handcuffs at the defendant's table, his tailored suit replaced by a plain gray jumpsuit, his hands folded calmly in his lap, as though he were waiting for a train rather than a verdict that could bury him for the rest of his life. Reporters packed the gallery behind him, whispering into phones, already drafting headlines that declared the fall of the Black Dragon Syndicate. Prosecutors shuffled their final papers with the confident ease of men who knew they had already won. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the room lurched to its feet as Judge O entered, her expression unreadable, a folder of the verdict already sealed in her hand. "Before I read this court's decision," she said, "is there any final matter either side wishes to raise?" Silence. The prosecution's lead attorney allowed himself the faintest smile. Then the courtroom's heavy double doors swung open. A young man walked in, no older than 23, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin, a leather briefcase in one hand, his expression calm, in a way that seemed almost impossible given the room he had just entered. Every head turned. Reporters murmured, confused, flipping through their notes for a name they didn't recognize. Chairman Kang Ji-Hoon, handcuffed and supposedly broken, looked up at the young man and smiled. A real, unguarded smile, the first anyone had seen from him in 11 months of trial. Nobody in that courtroom knew the young man had once been a starving 11-year-old boy sleeping under a Seoul overpass, and that the man now facing life in prison had been the one who saved him. "Your Honor," the young man said, setting his briefcase down on the defense table with quiet authority. "My name is Min-Jun. I apologize for my delayed entrance. I will be serving as lead defense counsel for Chairman Kang Ji-Hoon, effective immediately." The judge's eyebrows rose. The prosecution's smile disappeared entirely. 12 years earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. 11-year-old Min-Jun had learned that survival in Seoul's poorest alleys was not about strength. It was about vigilance, knowing which streets to avoid after dark, which strangers offered food out of kindness, and which offered it as bait, and above all, protecting his 8-year-old sister, Soo-min, who trusted him with the kind of blind faith that made every decision feel like it carried the weight of 2 lives instead of 1. They slept behind a shuttered noodle shop most nights, sharing a single flattened cardboard box against the concrete. Min-Jun always let Soo-min sleep closer to the wall, where the wind couldn't reach her as easily. "Are we going to eat tomorrow?" she asked one night, her voice small in the dark. "We always eat something," Min-Jun said, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. "I promise." He kept that promise through instinct sharpened by desperation, collecting bottles for recycling money, doing small errands for shopkeepers who paid in food rather than cash, occasionally accepting the charity of strangers when pride became a luxury he couldn't afford. What he refused, every single time, was the offer that came from the wrong kind of stranger. Men who approached children like him with soft voices and dangerous intentions, offering work that always came with a price no child should pay. He had learned to recognize those men from a distance. He had not yet learned to recognize the one man who would change his life forever, because that man didn't approach him with an offer at all. He simply watched. Chairman Kang Ji-Hoon had built his reputation on being unreadable. At 45, he ran the Black Dragon Syndicate with a controlled precision that unsettled even his most loyal captains. Men who had earned their positions through violence and now found themselves quietly outmaneuvered by a boss who rarely raised his voice. He had inherited the syndicate from his own father, a brutal man whose memory Ji-Hoon carried like a warning rather than an inspiration. He was passing through the alley behind the noodle shop on a routine check of one of the syndicate's smaller properties when he first noticed the 2 children sharing a single piece of cardboard against the cold. He might have walked past, as he had walked past 100 similar scenes before. But something in the way the older boy positioned himself, angled protectively toward his sister, alert even in exhaustion, watching Ji-Hoon's approach with calm calculation rather than fear, made him stop. 3 nights later, 2 loan sharks working for a rival operation cornered Min-Jun in a narrow alley, demanding he work off a debt that belonged to a father Min-Jun hadn't seen in years. "You're the son of Lee Sung-ho," one of them sneered, grabbing Min-Jun by the collar. "Your father owes us 4 million won. You're going to start paying it back, one way or another." "I don't know that man," Min-Jun said, voice steady despite his racing heart. "And I have nothing to give you." "Then we'll take your sister instead," the second man said. And something in Min-Jun's expression shifted from fear into something far more dangerous. The look of someone who had already decided he would rather die than allow that sentence to become real. "Touch her," Min-Jun said, voice shaking but unwavering, "and I'll make sure everyone in this district knows exactly what kind of men you are. I'll follow you. I'll find your families. I'll make sure you never sleep peacefully again." The first man laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Big words from a starving kid holding half a bottle. "Then take the words as a warning," Min-Jun said, "and see if I'm bluffing." He grabbed a broken bottle from the gutter, positioning himself directly between the men and the shadowed doorway where Soo-min was hidden. And he did not back down, even as the larger man raised a fist to strike him. The fist never landed. Ji-Hoon's hand caught the man's wrist mid-swing, twisting it with practiced efficiency, until the loan shark dropped to his knees with a pained gasp. His partner froze, recognizing immediately, from Ji-Hoon's composed stillness alone, exactly whose territory he had wandered into. "These children belong to nobody," Ji-Hoon said quietly. "Leave, and don't return to this street again." The men fled without another word. Min-Jun stood there, bottle still gripped tightly in his shaking hand, staring at the man who had just saved his life, with the same calculating wariness he gave everyone. "I don't need your help," Min-Jun said, though his voice betrayed the exhaustion beneath the defiance. "I didn't offer it as help," Ji-Hoon said. "I offered it because those men were about to make a mistake, and I don't enjoy watching mistakes happen when I can prevent them." He studied the boy for a long moment, taking in the protective stance, the sharp, intelligent eyes, the way he had positioned his own body as a shield without a second of hesitation. "What's your name?" Ji-Hoon asked. "Why does it matter?" "Because I'm going to test you tomorrow," Ji-Hoon said, "and I'd like to know what to call you when you pass." He returned the next day, and the day after that, never offering money outright, never making promises he wasn't certain he could keep. Instead, he tested Min-Jun in small, deliberate ways, leaving a wallet visibly unattended nearby to see if the boy would take it, offering him a single job carrying packages between 2 locations to see if he would open them, presenting him with more food than he needed to see if he would share it with his sister without being asked. Min-Jun passed every test without knowing he was being tested at all. He returned the wallet without touching a single bill inside it. He delivered the packages sealed exactly as he received them, never once curious enough to compromise the trust placed in him. He split every piece of food evenly with Soo-min, even when hunger made his hands tremble around the bread. "Why do you keep coming back?" Min-Jun finally asked, after the 5th day of visits. "Because you keep surprising me," Ji-Hoon said. "Most people, when nobody is watching, choose the easy path. You keep choosing the harder one. The easy path gets people killed out here," Min-Jun said simply. Ji-Hoon almost smiled at that. Almost. A week later, he made an offer that shocked everyone who would eventually hear about it. An offer that had nothing to do with the syndicate at all. "I want to adopt you," Ji-Hoon said. "Both you and your sister. You would have a home, an education, safety. In exchange, I ask only one thing." "What's the one thing?" Min-Jun asked warily. "That you never become what I am," Ji-Hoon said, You will grow up inside my world, surrounded by the reality of what I do. But you will never carry a weapon for this syndicate, never collect a debt, never inherit the parts of my life that I am not proud of. Do you understand? Min-Jun looked at his sister, asleep against the wall, her small chest rising and falling, with the peaceful rhythm only a child too young to understand danger could manage. I understand, Min-Jun said. I accept. The captains of the Black Dragon Syndicate did not accept it nearly as easily. Deputy Chairman Park Dong-sik, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s who had spent 3 decades clawing his way up through the syndicate's brutal hierarchy, voiced his objection the moment Ji-Hoon announced his decision to the inner circle. You're bringing a street rat into this family, Park said, disgust evident in every syllable. A boy with no blood ties to this organization, no loyalty earned through blood or sacrifice. What message does this send to the men who have bled for this syndicate for decades? The message, Ji-Hoon said calmly, is that loyalty and character matter more than blood. If that troubles you, Park, perhaps you should examine why. Park said nothing further in that meeting, but the resentment that took root that day would grow quietly for the next 12 years, buried beneath a mask of professional loyalty that fooled everyone except, perhaps, Ji-Hoon himself. Later that same week, Park met privately with 2 other senior captains in the back room of a private restaurant, voices low over untouched plates of food. He's replacing us, Park said, jaw tight. Slowly, quietly, with a street orphan who's never bled for this organization a single day in his life. Today it's adoption, tomorrow it's succession. Mark my words. Ji-Hoon has always made his own decisions, one of the captains said carefully, unwilling to openly agree with Park's anger, but equally unwilling to defend a decision that unsettled him as well. And look where his decisions are taking us, Park snapped. A chairman who spares strays instead of settling debts. We didn't survive 30 years of blood and prison sentences to hand this empire to a child who cried the first time he saw a gun. Neither captain answered, but neither one disagreed either, and Park noted their silence carefully, filing it away as the first quiet threads of a network he would spend over a decade weaving into something far more dangerous than mere disapproval. That night, standing over Min-Jun and Soo-Min's beds in his own home for the first time, Ji-Hoon made a promise he intended to keep no matter what it cost him. You'll never become a gangster, he whispered, more to himself than to the sleeping boy. Whatever else I fail to give you, I will give you that. The years that followed transformed Min-Jun in ways nobody inside the syndicate expected. Instead of combat training or lessons in intimidation, Ji-Hoon enrolled him in the most rigorous private academy in Seoul, hiring tutors in mathematics, literature, and eventually law, watching with quiet pride as the boy who once slept on cardboard began scoring at the top of every class he entered. Your grades are exceptional, his homeroom teacher told him during a parent conference Ji-Hoon attended in a plain business suit, nothing about his appearance suggesting the empire he controlled. Has he considered which universities he's interested in? Law, Min-Jun answered, before Ji-Hoon could speak. I want to study law. Ji-Hoon's expression remained neutral, but something in his chest tightened with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. Of every path Min-Jun could have chosen, law was the one that felt most like a quiet rebellion against everything Ji-Hoon represented, and also, somehow, the one that made him proudest. That evening, walking home together through the quiet streets near the academy, Min-Jun finally asked the question he had carried silently for years. Do you ever wish you'd raised me the way your father raised you? Min-Jun asked. Trained me the way the other captains train their sons? Ji-Hoon stopped walking, considering the question with the same careful weight he gave every important decision. My father trained me to survive a world built on fear, he said finally. I don't want you to merely survive that world, Min-Jun. I want you to have the power to change it, or to walk away from it entirely, whichever you choose. That kind of power doesn't come from a gun. It comes from what you're carrying in your books every night. Min-Jun said nothing, but he studied his adoptive father's face carefully in the streetlight, filing away the conversation the way he filed away every lesson Ji-Hoon had ever given him, not fully realizing yet how much he would need it in the years ahead. The other captains within the syndicate mocked what they called Min-Jun's soft upbringing whenever the topic arose in private conversations. The boy reads books while real men build empires, one captain sneered during a card game in the syndicate's private lounge. Ji-Hoon is raising a lawyer, not a successor. Maybe that's exactly the point, Park said quietly, though his tone carried none of the admiration the words implied. Privately, Park saw Min-Jun's education as confirmation of his own theory, that Ji-Hoon was slowly abandoning the syndicate's true purpose, weakening it from within, opening the door for a man like Park to finally claim what he believed he deserved. While Min-Jun studied, Ji-Hoon began a transformation of his own, one he kept carefully hidden from most of his organization. Piece by piece, he began converting segments of the Black Dragon Syndicate's operations into legitimate businesses. A logistics company that quietly absorbed the syndicate's smuggling routes into legal freight contracts. A real estate arm that turned laundered properties into above-board developments. A private security firm that gave many of his soldiers legal employment for the first time in their lives. "You're dismantling everything your father built," Park told him during one of their increasingly tense private meetings. "I'm building something that can survive without fear as its foundation," Ji-Hoon replied. "My father built an empire that required constant violence to maintain. I want to build something that outlives me without requiring the same." "And what happens to the men who don't fit into your legitimate little vision?" Park asked, an edge creeping into his voice. "They adapt," Ji-Hoon said, "or they leave. Those are the only two options I intend to offer." Park left that meeting with his jaw tight and his resentment sharpened into something far more dangerous than mere disagreement. Behind Ji-Hoon's back, Park began quietly expanding operations that had nothing to do with legitimacy, reopening smuggling routes Ji-Hoon believed had been closed, establishing new partnerships with corrupt officials willing to look away from illegal shipments in exchange for generous bribes, building a private network of loyal soldiers who answered to him alone rather than to the chairman above him. It was Min-Jun, during a rare visit home from university, who first noticed something wrong in the financial records Ji-Hoon occasionally allowed him to review as part of his informal legal education. "These shipment invoices don't match the customs declarations," Min-Jun said one evening, spreading several documents across Ji-Hoon's desk. "Someone's running 2 sets of books through the logistics company." Ji-Hoon studied the documents in silence for a long moment, his expression darkening as the implications settled over him. "Who has access to falsify these?" Min-Jun asked. "Very few people," Ji-Hoon said quietly, "which makes this considerably more dangerous than a simple accounting error." He didn't share his suspicions with Min-Jun that night, unwilling to burden the boy, now a young man of 20, with the full weight of a betrayal he wasn't yet certain how to prove. But the seed of doubt Min-Jun had planted grew quickly, and over the following months, Ji-Hoon began quietly gathering evidence of his own, tracing discrepancies back through shell accounts, cross-referencing shipment manifests, building a picture that pointed with increasing certainty toward the one man he had trusted with nearly everything. If you've made it this far into the story, you already know it's about to get a lot more dangerous. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because you won't want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment below telling me honestly, if you were Chairman Kang, would you have trusted loyalty earned through blood or loyalty proven through character? I read every single comment, and I want to know where you stand. And if this story already has you hooked, smash that like button before we continue, because the fall is about to begin. The evidence Ji-Hoon had quietly gathered over months never reached the courtroom he intended it for, because Park moved first. Working through corrupt officials he had spent years cultivating, Park orchestrated an elaborate frame, planting falsified financial records under Ji-Hoon's personal accounts, forging shipment manifests that implicated the chairman directly in trafficking operations that Ji-Hoon had spent years trying to dismantle, and leaking selectively doctored evidence to a prosecutor eager to make his career on the downfall of the Black Dragon Syndicate's most visible leader. The raid came at dawn, when Ji-Hoon least expected it. Dozens of police vehicles surrounded syndicate headquarters, officers pouring through every entrance with warrants that named specific accounts, specific shipments, specific dates, details too precise to have been assembled without inside knowledge. Kang Ji-Hoon, the lead detective said, stepping into his private office, as Ji-Hoon rose calmly from his desk. "You're under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy, and international trafficking." "On what evidence?" Ji-Hoon asked, already suspecting the answer would be evidence he had never touched. "Financial records with your signature," the detective said, "recovered from 3 separate accounts, linked directly to your name." Ji-Hoon extended his wrists without resistance, his mind already working through the implications, even as the handcuffs clicked shut around them. Someone had built this case with intimate knowledge of his operations, someone who understood exactly which accounts would carry the most damning weight, someone who had access few people in the entire organization possessed. He looked past the detective toward the office doorway, where Park stood watching the arrest unfold with an expression that might have passed for concern to anyone who didn't know him well enough to recognize the satisfaction hiding beneath it. "Take care of things while I'm gone, Park," Ji-Hoon said evenly, watching his deputy's face for any flicker of guilt. He found none. As officers led him through the headquarters he had run for over 2 decades, soldiers who had served under him for years averted their eyes rather than meet his gaze, some out of shame, others out of the same calculated self-preservation Park had spent months cultivating throughout the organization. Only one young soldier, barely out of his teens, offered a quiet nod of respect as Ji-Hoon passed, a small gesture that would mean more to the chairman in the months ahead than he could have anticipated in that moment. Outside, news vans had already gathered, tipped off with a speed that could only mean someone inside the operation had coordinated the timing deliberately. Cameras flashed as Ji-Hoon was placed into the back of an unmarked police vehicle, the syndicate's fall broadcast live before he had even reached the station for processing. Within days, nearly every captain who had once sworn loyalty to Ji-Hoon began quietly distancing themselves, their statements to investigators carefully worded to protect their own interests, while offering no meaningful defense of the chairman, now facing decades in prison. "I only followed his orders," one captain told investigators. "I had no knowledge of these specific accounts." Chairman Kang kept his most sensitive dealings extremely private, another testified. "None of us were positioned to know the full extent of his operations." Park orchestrated each of these carefully worded betrayals from behind the scenes, positioning himself as the reasonable, stabilizing presence the syndicate needed during a crisis of leadership, quietly consolidating power even as the organization's public face collapsed under legal scrutiny. The cruelest blow came not from the captains, but from the silence of the one person Ji-Hoon had expected to stand beside him. Min-Jun disappeared 3 days after the arrest. He withdrew from his final semester of law school without explanation, stopped answering calls from concerned professors and classmates, and vanished from every location where anyone might have expected to find him. Rumors spread quickly through the syndicate, and eventually into the press, that the adopted son, given every advantage a homeless boy could never have imagined, had abandoned his father the moment loyalty became inconvenient. Even the son he saved couldn't stomach standing beside him, one tabloid headline read. "Blood matters more than charity, even for a mafia boss." Reporters camped outside Min-Jun's last known apartment for weeks, interviewing former classmates who described a young man who had seemingly vanished overnight, leaving behind an unfinished semester, an abandoned lease, and no forwarding information of any kind. His university issued a brief statement confirming his withdrawal without offering any explanation, fueling speculation that ranged from simple cowardice to darker theories involving hidden debts or secret criminal ties of his own. Ji-Hoon read that headline alone in his holding cell, and for the first time since his arrest, something in his composed expression cracked. "Do you believe he betrayed you?" his court-appointed attorney asked during one of their initial meetings, watching the chairman's reaction carefully. Ji-Hoon was silent for a long moment, staring at his own reflection in the small steel mirror bolted to the cell wall. "I raised that boy to choose the harder path, even when the easier one costs nothing," Ji-Hoon finally said. "I have to believe there's a reason I don't yet understand." But even Ji-Hoon, in his darkest private moments, felt the sting of doubt creeping into certainty he had built over 12 years of fatherhood. Perhaps loyalty truly couldn't be taught. Perhaps blood, in the end, was the only bond that held under real pressure. The trial date was announced 3 months later, and the media coverage transformed into a spectacle unlike anything Seoul's underworld had seen in over a decade. Every major outlet ran predictions of the Black Dragon Syndicate's imminent collapse. Legal analysts speculated about sentencing ranges. Rival syndicates began quietly positioning themselves to absorb territory that would inevitably become available once Ji-Hoon's conviction became official. Inside the courtroom on the trial's opening day, prosecutors presented their case with the confident precision of men who knew they held an unbeatable hand. Financial expert witnesses walked the jury through forged documents with damning technical certainty. Former captains testified with rehearsed reluctance about operations they claimed only Ji-Hoon could have orchestrated. Surveillance photographs, carefully selected and misleadingly captioned, painted a picture of guilt that seemed impossible to refute. Ji-Hoon's court-appointed attorney, a competent but overwhelmed public defender named Attorney Choi, did his best against a prosecution with seemingly limitless resources, but even he privately admitted, during a recess 3 weeks into the trial, that the evidence appeared devastating. "I won't lie to you, Chairman Kang," Choi said quietly during a private consultation. "This is one of the strongest prosecution cases I've encountered in 15 years of practice." "I understand," Ji-Hoon said, his expression remaining unnervingly calm despite the mounting evidence against him. "You don't seem concerned," Choi observed. "I've made peace with several possible outcomes," Ji-Hoon said. "But concern implies I believe this trial's conclusion is already decided. I'm not entirely certain of that yet." Choi studied him carefully, unable to determine whether the chairman's composure reflected genuine confidence in something Choi wasn't aware of, or simple resignation dressed up as calm. Weeks turned into months, and the prosecution's momentum never slowed. Each new witness added another layer of damning testimony. Each new exhibit tightened the case further, until even the most sympathetic courtroom observers began quietly predicting the maximum possible sentence. Reporters outside the courthouse grew bored, waiting for a defense that never seemed to materialize, filing increasingly repetitive stories about the inevitable fall of a once feared chairman. Inside his cell each night, Ji-Hoon replayed the same private doubt, on a loop he couldn't silence no matter how hard he tried. He had built an empire, dismantled parts of it in the name of something better, raised a son to choose character over blood, and now faced the possibility that all of it would end in a cell, with the one person he had hoped might stand beside him nowhere to be found. 11 months into an increasingly grim trial, on the morning prosecutors had scheduled their final closing arguments before the verdict, the courtroom doors swung open, and Min-Jun walked back into his father's life, exactly when he was needed most. "Your Honor," Min-Jun said, setting his briefcase down with the same quiet authority that had first caught the judge's attention. "I apologize for my delayed entrance. I will be serving as lead defense counsel for Chairman Kang Ji-Hoon, effective immediately." Judge Oh studied the young attorney with obvious surprise. This is an unusual request this late in proceedings, Mr. Lee. You'll need to establish your standing with this court before I can permit such a substitution. Of course, Your Honor, Min-Jun said, producing a folder of credentials with practiced efficiency. I graduated at the top of my class from Seoul National University's School of Law 8 months ago. I have spent the time since then working alongside a private investigative team, building a case that I believe demonstrates my client's complete innocence, and identifying the true architect behind these charges. Whispers erupted through the gallery. Reporters scrambled to update their notes. The prosecution's lead attorney, who had spent 11 months anticipating an easy victory, felt something cold settle in his stomach for the first time. "Where have you been for the last 3 months, Mr. Lee?" the prosecutor demanded, unable to hide his unease. The defendant's own son disappeared the moment his father was arrested. Are we to believe this sudden reappearance is coincidental? "I disappeared," Min-Jun said calmly, turning to face the prosecutor directly, "because I discovered, within days of my father's arrest, that whoever framed him had intimate knowledge of our organization's most sensitive operations. I understood immediately that anyone close to my father, including myself, would be watched, followed, and potentially silenced if I began investigating openly. I disappeared because staying visible would have gotten me killed before I could prove his innocence." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Judge O, after a brief private consultation with both attorneys, granted Min-Jun's request to serve as lead counsel, giving him until the following morning to prepare his defense. That night, in a small rented office he had used as his secret base of operations for the past 3 months, Min-Jun laid out every piece of evidence he had gathered, arranging documents across a wall with the same meticulous precision that had made him the top student in his graduating class. "You've built an entire case in secret," his private investigator, a former police detective named Han Soo-jin, who had grown disillusioned with department corruption years earlier, observed. "Are you certain this will be enough?" "It has to be," Min-Jun said, studying the wall of evidence with quiet determination. "My father raised me to choose the harder path, even when it costs everything. I'm not walking into that courtroom tomorrow to lose." The following morning, the courtroom filled beyond capacity, word having spread overnight about the mysterious return of the chairman's adopted son. Min-Jun began his defense not with dramatic declarations, but with methodical precision, calling the prosecution's lead financial witness back to the stand for cross-examination. "You testified that these account signatures belong to my client," Min-Jun said, presenting a large screen displaying the disputed documents. "Can you explain the inconsistency between the pressure patterns in this signature and the pressure patterns in 12 verified samples of my client's actual handwriting, provided to this court as Exhibit 47? The witness, a forensic accountant who had spent 11 months confidently asserting the document's authenticity, hesitated visibly under the specific technical challenge. "Signature analysis isn't always perfectly consistent," the witness said carefully. "I agree," Min-Jun said, "which is why I brought in an independent forensic document examiner, whose full report I'm entering into evidence now, demonstrating conclusively that these signatures were produced using a mechanical tracing device, not written by my client's hand." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Judge O reviewed the report, her expression shifting from professional neutrality into something closer to genuine surprise. Over the following 2 days, Min-Jun systematically dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece, exposing forensic inconsistencies in the financial documents, revealing gaps in the surveillance photograph timelines that suggested careful manipulation, and calling forward 2 former syndicate employees who had quietly agreed to testify after Min-Jun's investigator spent months building their trust. Deputy Chairman Park approached me 8 months before Chairman Kang's arrest. One witness, a former accountant named Mrs. Yom, testified nervously. He asked me to create duplicate financial records that mirrored legitimate transactions but rerouted certain funds through accounts I didn't recognize. When I asked why, he told me it was for the chairman's protection. I didn't learn until much later that those accounts would eventually be presented as evidence against Chairman Kang himself. Were you ever compensated for this work? Min-Jun asked. Yes, Mrs. Yom admitted, her voice trembling. Generously. Far more than my actual salary. I told myself it didn't matter what the money was for, as long as I didn't ask questions. I've regretted that silence every day since Chairman Kang's arrest was announced. The prosecution attempted to discredit her testimony as the bitter accusation of a disgruntled former employee. But Min-Jun had anticipated the challenge, presenting bank records that corroborated every payment she described, down to the exact dates and amounts, each one tracing back to an account Park had believed was untraceable. A second witness, a young customs officer named Officer Ryu, who had grown increasingly uneasy with the bribes he'd been accepting, corroborated the timeline further, describing specific shipments he had been paid to misclassify at Park's direct instruction, always with careful instructions to ensure any resulting paperwork trail pointed toward Chairman Kang's personal accounts rather than Park's own. The prosecution's confidence, so absolute just days earlier, began visibly crumbling as Min-Jun continued building an alternative narrative supported by hard evidence rather than assumption. On the trial's final dramatic day, Min-Jun called his most devastating witness. The defense calls Detective Han Soo-jin to the stand, Min-Jun announced, and his private investigator walked forward, presenting surveillance recordings that had taken months of careful, dangerous work to obtain. These recordings, Detective Han testified, were obtained from a private security system installed at a warehouse used by Deputy Chairman Park for meetings he did not want documented through official syndicate channels. They show Park meeting with corrupt customs officials, discussing payment for falsified shipment manifests, discussing the framing of Chairman Kang specifically, 6 months before the arrest took place. The courtroom erupted as the recordings played, Park's own voice, captured with damning clarity, discussing the precise details of a conspiracy that had cost Ji-Hoon nearly a year of his freedom and reputation. I want him gone, Park's recorded voice said, tinny but unmistakable through the courtroom speakers. Once Kang is convicted, the syndicate falls to me, and nobody will ever question how it happened. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward the gallery, where Park sat frozen, his carefully maintained mask of concerned loyalty finally shattering into open panic. Bailiff, Judge O said, her voice sharp with authority. Detain that man immediately. Chaos erupted as court security moved toward Park, who attempted to flee toward the exit before being restrained by 2 officers who had clearly anticipated exactly this moment. 2 corrupt officials named in the recordings, present in the gallery to observe what they believed would be a successful conclusion to their conspiracy, were identified and detained within minutes, their expressions shifting from confidence to horror as they realized the scope of Min-Jun's preparation. 3 additional captains, whose betrayal Min-Jun's investigation had also uncovered through financial records connecting them to Park's private network, were arrested within the same hour, their carefully rehearsed testimonies now exposed as calculated perjury rather than reluctant honesty. Ji-Hoon, still seated at the defendant's table throughout the chaos, watched his adopted son dismantle a conspiracy that had nearly destroyed everything he had built, and for the first time since his arrest, tears he had refused to shed throughout 11 months of trial finally slipped down his composed face. Your Honor, Min-Jun said, once order had been restored, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had defined every moment of his defense. The evidence I've presented today conclusively demonstrates that my client, Chairman Kang Ji-Hoon, is the victim of an elaborate conspiracy orchestrated by his own deputy chairman, seeking to seize control of the organization through fabricated charges. I respectfully request this court dismiss all charges against my client immediately. Judge O reviewed the evidence for nearly an hour in her chambers before returning to deliver her verdict. The courtroom, holding its breath in a silence, more absolute than anything the trial had produced in 11 previous months. Given the overwhelming evidence of fabrication and conspiracy presented by the defense, Judge O announced, "This court finds all charges against Kang Ji-Hoon dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Kang, you are free to go." The gallery erupted, reporters scrambling toward exits to file breaking news, cameras flashing in a frenzy that hadn't occurred since the trial's opening day. Ji-Hoon rose slowly from the defendant's table as an officer removed his handcuffs for the final time, his eyes fixed on the young man standing beside him. "You came back," Ji-Hoon said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered concealing. "I never left," Min-Jun said. "I just couldn't fight this battle standing where everyone could see me. I needed the world to believe I'd abandoned you, so Park would never suspect what I was actually building. You let the whole world believe you betrayed me," Ji-Hoon said. "Even I believed it for a while." "I know," Min-Jun said, his composed expression finally cracking under the weight of 11 months of secrecy. "And I'm sorry for every day that doubt cost you. But I couldn't risk protecting your reputation if it meant losing the chance to protect your freedom." Ji-Hoon pulled his adopted son into an embrace that neither of them had allowed themselves during the entire ordeal. 12 years of complicated, evolving fatherhood finally settling into something neither loan sharks nor corrupt deputies nor fabricated evidence could unmake. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions about the syndicate's future now that its chairman had been vindicated and his treacherous deputy exposed before an international audience. "Chairman Kang," one reporter called out, "will you rebuild the Black Dragon Syndicate? Will you seek retribution against those who betrayed you?" Ji-Hoon paused at the top of the courthouse steps, Min-Jun standing beside him, and considered the question with the same measured calm that had defined his entire adult life. "The Black Dragon Syndicate ends today," Ji-Hoon announced, and the crowd of reporters fell into stunned silence. Not through defeat, but through choice. Every legitimate business built under its umbrella will be reorganized into a legal corporation, transferred entirely under the leadership of my son, Lee Min-Jun, effective immediately. "And the criminal operations?" another reporter pressed. "The territory, the connections, the influence you've spent decades building?" "Dissolved," Ji-Hoon said simply. "I built an empire that required fear to survive. My son just proved that loyalty, patience, and truth can accomplish what fear never could. I have no interest in rebuilding something that nearly cost me everything, including the one person who ever proved that love could outlast blood." He removed a heavy gold ring from his finger, the chairman's ring his own father had worn for 30 years before him, and held it out toward the crowd of cameras before quietly placing it into his jacket pocket, instead of returning it to his hand. "I won't be wearing this again," he said. That evening, away from cameras and reporters, Ji-Hoon and Min-Jun sat together on the same modest balcony where, 12 years earlier, an 11-year-old boy had once slept on cardboard beneath the stars, unaware that his life was about to change forever. "Do you regret any of it?" Min-Jun asked quietly. "The years you spent building something you just chose to destroy." "I don't regret building it," Ji-Hoon said. "I regret how long it took me to understand it was never the thing worth protecting. You were." He looked at his son with the same quiet pride he had felt the day a homeless boy refused to hand over a stranger's wallet. "Family isn't defined by blood, Min-Jun. It never was. It's defined by the people who stand beside you when the rest of the world walks away." Min-Jun was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the same skyline that had once represented nothing but danger and hunger to a boy with no one but his sister to rely on. "Soo-min called me this afternoon," Min-Jun said eventually. "She saw the news. She cried when she heard the verdict." "How is she?" Ji-Hoon asked, his voice softening at the mention of the girl he had also raised, now a young woman finishing her own studies abroad. "Proud," Min-Jun said. "Of both of us," she said. "She wanted me to tell you, She never once believed the headlines. Not for a single day. Ji-Hoon nodded slowly, something in his chest loosening that had remained tight since the morning of his arrest. I used to wonder, Ji-Hoon admitted, whether saving 2 children on a cold street corner was the one truly good decision I made in an otherwise complicated life. Watching you in that courtroom, I finally have my answer. Min-Jun smiled, the first fully unguarded smile he had allowed himself in over a year. Then, I suppose we're exactly the family you always said we'd become, he said. Somewhere below them, the city moved on, unaware that an empire built on fear had quietly chosen, in its final hour, to become something entirely different. A father and son, standing together, having finally proven that the hardest path was always the one worth choosing. If this story moved you the way it moved us to write it, do one thing before you go. Hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and drop a comment telling us honestly whether you saw Min-Jun's disappearance coming or whether it caught you completely off guard, the way it caught the whole city off guard. We read every single comment, and stories like this one only keep coming because of viewers like you. Thank you for watching until the very end, and we'll see you in the next story.